wellness company. Thank you. Guy also founded one of the first compliant companies in Colorado in 2012. He previously designed and built manufactured infused products, facilities, MIPs in multiple states, making him an expert in cannabis science, technology, strategy, and production. He also has experience caring for patients with cannabis, as he spent many years as Montel Williams' caregiver during his battle with MS. That must be an interesting story, Guy. He graduated from Rochester Institute of Technology and is a U.S. Navy veteran. He uses his keen understanding of the cannabis plant, cannabis culture, and business acumen to craft a variety of wellness products. He's on a mission to unlock the power of the plant to improve people's lives. It's all yours, Guy.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for allowing me to share some of my experience in the cannabis industry. As Jane said, my name is Guy Rocourt. I am currently CEO of Papa and Barkley, and I also have GR Consulting. I think Jane did a great job at giving you a little bit of my background, but just I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just share one slide of my personal timeline, but it's, pretty much what she just said there. So hopefully you guys can see that. So yeah, in, the late 90s, I was in the movie industry, and to give you a little bit more color about myself, I'm originally from New York City. And like many young kids in the 80s, I decided to join the military, thinking I'd be like all Top Gun and whatnot. And when I got my scholarship, I went to college, and then all of a sudden we start downsizing, and then the Cold War ends. And so I think about the military not being necessarily this viable thing. So I go into filmmaking, and my life has been pretty good about timing. So I leave the military, I leave my scholarship. I decide to disenroll from my scholarship. I stay in college. I finish with a film degree. I head to New York right when low budget filmmaking is taking off, and I end up working for Montel Williams. Now, I knew that he was a talk show host. I didn't know that much more about him, but come to find that he was in the military. He was on submarines. I was on submarines. We get this quick bond. And of course, on our movie, he comes out with his MS. I share some cannabis with him. At that time, my cannabis use is literally like everybody else's, recreational. I don't really understand the plant at all, but I start to see how much it helps Montel from a pain management perspective. And he becomes quite the advocate and going around getting all the latest research. And in 1998, it was very prohibited. It is not where we are now. People were being jailed even at the thought of it, especially in some of the southern states and outside city centers. But working with Montel really gave me an eye-opening into what cannabis can do specifically for autoimmune diseases. And when you think about autoimmune diseases, it's anything that attacks the body. So that's all cancers, that's MS, that's lupus, that's Crohn's, right? And we know at the time, right after Dr. Raphael Mechoulam has identified the endocannabinoid system, and for those of you who don't know what the endocannabinoid system is, it's a system in our body, not unlike our nervous system, that is recently discovered, and by recently, I mean 1996, and for a bodily function to only be really fully discerned less than 20, 30 years ago, that's fairly recent. What we do know about the endocannabinoid system is that it brings homeostasis to the body, right? We're still deciphering exactly how these cannabinoids interface with the ECS to help the body. There's a lot of research to be done. As cannabis is only just now leaving prohibition, it's still federally prohibited. So universities, even like Humboldt State and such, are not really putting it all out there in terms of research, because there is some risk. There is some risk that at any time the feds could be like, you're not getting funding if you do X, Y, and Z. I think that's gotten a lot better over the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, but definitely the level of research around the cannabis plant is nowhere near what it should be. So in any case, I, at one point, moved to California. I'm still working in entertainment. I work for Paramount in Los Angeles, and I, start seeing what's happening with what we call our 215 medical program in California, and I'm enamored by it. And being that I was in the military and was on every single list, if you will, had, clearance to be on my sub, I didn't feel uncomfortable getting a cannabis card. A lot of people did, including my first partner, Alex, who had Crohn's disease, and I was providing cannabis for him. And at one point, we decided, hey, we're going to take this room in my little bungalow and start growing cannabis. Well, 2 lights becomes 4 lights, and it becomes this passion about just first trying to cultivate the flower, then seeing how much it helps Alex with Crohn's disease, still sharing those flowers with Montel, sharing them with my larger community. I become obsessed with perfecting this plant medicine. That persists for almost 10 years. I didn't really intend to kind of like be an outlaw, but it just kind of happened. And in 2009, I saw the first electronic cigarettes. And electronic cigarettes, as you know, are, this weird kind of like, oh, well, they have nicotine. Are they good for you? Are they bad for you? One thing I look at them as I'm like, well, there's no carcinogens like smoking cigarettes, so perhaps they are. And of course, how can we get cannabis in there, right? Because the one thing about cannabis at that time, around 2010 is like nobody's smoking cigarettes anymore. Somehow we had moved from in 1998 when I left the military, or just after I left the military, I was smoking cigarettes a lot. Smoking was fairly acceptable. And then within 20 years, it becomes not acceptable. And so by 2010, we are not smoking anywhere. And I realized that smoking cannabis also brings these similar carcinogens. So I developed this vape pen formula with my partner, Alex. Immediately that starts to get traction. Colorado starts to think about legalizing. I get called by these venture capitalist folks to start a cannabis brand, an actual compliant brand in Colorado. My first vape pen brand here in California was called Black Diamond. It was under our 215 guys. And under the 215 framework, we really didn't brand things because branding was kind of frowned on because technically the collective agreement, you should have stayed in one dispensary. It wasn't about building a big brand throughout the state. So needless to say, I do take that first opportunity. I go to Colorado. I found this vape company and it's amazing. Like it's like selling into a vacuum. It's taking off. The concept of recreational cannabis, people being able to come in with just their license and buy cannabis is a small miracle for many. And, you have a lot of tourism and whatnot. And I really now have kind of gotten out of the closet, as it were, and into business in cannabis. That first foray allows me to become a consultant where I consult on several grows in Arizona, California, Nevada, and Colorado as they're all setting up. And I want y'all to remember that point because I will come back, because one of the things that I've realized is my journey in cannabis is about lessons learned. I've made what some could say mistakes, but I really try not to focus them on mistakes because I try to look at them as lessons learned. I did things that I didn't know better, and now I do, and I feel like it's important that I voice the missteps that I made so that we can all just share in those lessons learned, hence the point of this presentation. So by 2012, I'm consulting, and around 2015-ish, I meet my partner, Papa and Barkley, who had taken the cannabis plant, soaked it in cannabis oil, in coconut oil, rubbed it on his dad's back, and his dad gets off of hospice. So Papa, in the Papa and Barkley story, is my partner, Adam Grossman's dad, who was on hospice and was, they were like, if he doesn't get out of bed, it's going to be problematic in the next couple of weeks. Out of desperation, his son takes these flowers, like inhalable grade flowers that he purchased from a friend, and this is in Massachusetts, soaks them in coconut oil, rubs it on his dad's back, and sure enough, Papa gets off of hospice, lives for several years later for more, in order to see this company formed and everything. Barkley was his comfort dog that would like sleep with him and keep him warm and such. So we named the company after him, Papa and Barkley. The aha moment there was when I was in Colorado, I was quickly, like many people, wanting to over-refine cannabis. And I thought all the toys that I had been denied in prohibition were the toys that I actually needed in order to make good cannabis products. But in meeting my partner at Papa and Barkley, I realized, wait a minute, what I'd been doing for almost the previous 20 years at that point, well, 15 years at that point, and more importantly, what all the other advocates who had sired me into this industry had been doing were things that were grown in grandma's garden and made in grandma's kitchen. Many people don't know that this movement started with the Women's Alliance in Santa Barbara pushing the need for cannabis, right? Especially when it comes to things like menopause, things like breast cancer. These were their focus on using this healing medicine instead of the alternatives. Of course, you had the whole LGBT community pushing back on all the AIDS medicine and the need for cannabis there as well. That's a whole separate set of advocacy. But at the end of the day, all of them were looking for plant medicine, a natural alternative to some of the more toxic cocktails that were being provided by pharma. So I think this sets the stage now for the presentation that it's actually my first time doing it. I'm hoping to make it a little ebook on my website because education is king. As you all know, we live in a world of tremendous misinformation, and somehow in my lifetime, I've seen facts become a personal thing instead of an objective fact. That can't stand if we're going to have a civilization. And so in our emerging industry that has already been marginalized and demonized, misinformation burns like wildfire. And as a emerging immature industry, I think it's super important for us to have a common set of nomenclature, some objective facts that we all know and believe in, right? But that only comes through sharing education and sharing knowledge. And so I'm always honored when I have a platform to share some of my lessons learned. So again, I thank the folks at OLLI, and I thank you all for joining and listening. So the first lesson that I learned, and it was a very harsh one, I have to tell you, was first mover advantage or first mover sacrifice. You would think that because I founded a company early on in 2010, and then founded one of the first companies in California in 2016. I remember being here in Humboldt the first time, late 2015. I remember being in Humboldt right when we voted bittersweetly in 2016, and we got the legalization nod. And I was like, wow, we're the first. We're going to plant a flag, and what a tremendous advantage that is. Well, the lesson learned is that a first mover advantage is not always what it seems. In fact, I think it's probably more appropriately called first mover sacrifice. Similar to, we just celebrated D-Day. The people on the front lines and first to run out often pay a heavy toll. And I think that today, looking back, those of us who participated in advocacy, those of us who were the first to step out and hang shingles in 2015, those of us who were the first to raise money and put real business acumen to cannabis have sacrificed, because we do have a cannabis industry now, and I don't believe it's going to go backwards. I do believe that with the president announcing the rescheduling, I think it's important to know that the president said those words beyond the DEA, because I don't know that you can believe the DEA, but if hearing it from literally the White House, I do believe that some sort of rescheduling is happening. And why is that important? Because it's important for the feds to recognize the medical benefits of California, if anything, just so that the businesses can operate like other businesses. For those of you who don't know, the first cannabis businesses, in fact, all cannabis businesses as of today, as far as the feds are concerned, are illegal businesses, which means that we cannot claim tax deductions like other businesses. We cannot go to a Bank of America or traditional lenders for loans. And there are many industries that will not participate with us for fear that their federal insurance or their federally backed insurance may be jeopardized. That even includes universities. So even if I wanted to sponsor a study as a plant-touching cannabis company with a university, I might get pushback. Like I said, it's gotten a lot better now, but just a few years ago when Papa and Barkley tried to do that, it was a non-starter because most universities take federal funds and are afraid to partner with plant-touching companies for fear that they'll be out of line with the feds. And so now, with this rescheduling happening, I think it's going to get a lot easier. But companies like Papa and Barkley, companies like Neo sacrificed and got into a business situation that was untenable. I think there was so much excitement and so much heat in the marketplace, and dollars and investment dollars were coming in, that we did not really see that the framework of business as it was mandated by the state and the onerous taxation from the federal government, not allowing us to take simple business deductions, was setting us up for failure. And if you guys don't know, the cannabis industry right now, especially in California, is under collapse, right? Many issues plague it, all stemming from the fact that between the excise tax, the non-ability to take federal taxes, the inability to get even bridge financing or traditional loans, have made it quite difficult. In addition, we've had outside players backed by pharma and alcohol specifically come in and create what we call large MSOs. A lot of them don't operate in California because luckily for us here in California, we already had such a robust pre-existing 215 market that they've had trouble penetrating. However, all the other states that you hear about are pretty much dominated by 3 or 4 large MSOs who are really trying to force the plant into a pharma model where they don't want to see the plant medicine. They want to take the plant medicine, call it biomass, reduce it down to its active pharmaceutical ingredients, whether that's THC, CBD, or otherwise, put that in a formulation and call that cannabis. Well, that's not exactly right because, again, for those of you who don't know, during Prohibition, we did have access to a concept, 2 products, Marinol and Sativex. Those are isolated synthetic THC compounds that were put into cocktails to be used. The reason why they never became popular is because they're largely ineffective. And even today, many of the cannabis products that are driven by the active pharmaceutical ingredient are not effective. Why? Because we know that our cannabis receptors want to have more than one cannabinoid present. Back in Israel, in Dr. Meshulam's lab, when he discovered the ECS, he realized we also secrete cannabinoids, but we usually secrete multiple cannabinoids, and one essentially softens the lock, if you will, while the other truly bonds with the receptor. And when we take in cannabis, the reason why we want to have a full spectrum or a whole plant cannabinoid or whole plant cannabis extract that includes CBD, by the way, you want to have other cannabinoids present to soften the lock so that the primary cannabinoid can do its work. So even if you're buying, let's say, CBD online, the reason why you'd want to look for a whole plant formulation with trace amounts of other cannabinoids, including trace amounts of THC, is because it'll end up being more effective. In fact, it will be effective compared to just having the isolated CBD. But I digress, and I could easily go down the rabbit hole. The point is, the first of us to come out and found cannabis businesses and push this industry yet to the next level and kind of come out of the closet of prohibition really gained no advantage. In fact, I think what we did was we sacrificed everything. I can tell you from personal experience, I partnered with money folks. Papa and Barkley raised $70 million. We brought that into the community. Okay, Humboldt definitely made some missteps. I think we can see it in Garberville. I think we can see it in the storefronts of Eureka. The cash crop that was here during our, quote, black market days is no longer here, yet regulators failed to move quickly enough to make Humboldt the center of cannabis like it should be, and I think it still could be, and we've lost those economics. The farmers inland from here on the coast are suffering because the rest of the state went crazy just producing biomass, thus driving the price down. And while the quality is nowhere near what might be able to be done in some of these legacy farms, well, what is quality to the uneducated consumer when it's filled with misinformation? So our sacrifice was, yes, to push the industry forward and demand this legalization. But unfortunately, right now, our sacrifice seems like it is at risk, because we don't really have a robust cannabis industry that's putting out quality medicine and an alternative to wellness compared to what we had before. If our wellness paradigm was working, let's say in 2015, there would have been no need to really legalize cannabis. There was a need, there was a movement, because this plant medicine was so profound when it helped folks that we needed to have it out there and be available and provide safe access. And safe access was the first mandate. And now we have safe access. However, the products inside are not exactly what they should be. So I will move on to the next point. And I think I've articulated that first mover advantage, it's really more like first mover sacrifice. So I see a question in the chat. I'm going to answer this one really quickly, but if you guys want to keep them in the chat or write them down, I'm just going to go through everything and then I'll answer. And I will definitely answer how the endocannabinoid system works towards the end, or maybe in one of these. But the question about has federal Schedule I status actually changed yet? The answer is no. We are still awaiting, and patiently waiting, and I hope that the DEA does announce something this summer. That is when we expect that to happen. And it hopefully will also bring the abatement of what's called 280E, which is the line in the tax code that says cannabis is an illicit drug with no value, and therefore our business is illicit and we can take no deductions. We're not looked at as an actual real business, and hopefully that'll change this summer, but it has not changed yet. So my second lesson learned was the consumer journey in an emerging market. When I first started Papa and Barkley, my first company was a little bit wild, wild west, right? So I won't talk about that. But when I started Papa and Barkley, like I said, we raised a lot of money with a lot of smart business people from a diverse background of business. And we decided to make this emerging industry really thrive, a lot of money. Let's see what we're doing. We hire expert marketers from CPG, from things like Tylenol and Clorox. And the first thing they tell me is, you're not the consumer that we're looking for. You need to meet the consumer where they are. And I'm like, well, okay, you guys are marketing professionals. I'll listen to what you're going to say and we'll do that. So at that time, they're like, you know, gummies need to be 1 milligram. People have no tolerance. You don't understand. You got to meet the consumer where they are. This persists for a few years. And then luckily, we were able to sponsor a study with Strategic Research Group, I believe is their name. And we interviewed a bunch of people, almost 2,000 people. And what we started to realize is that people have a lot of cannabis shame. Cannabis has been demonized and nobody really wants to talk about their use of cannabis. And usually participants would deny their use of cannabis until maybe 10 minutes into the interview. And then a story from college or a story from years back would come up. What we distilled out of all these interviews was that the cannabis consumer is on a journey. It's on a journey first to push out that systemic bias, right? Like realize, oh, wait, I was told incorrect information, and now I need to put that aside and embrace this plant that's been demonized, and it's going to help me, well, whatever that means. So they're on this journey from being totally scared of the plant to thinking it's good for them to wherever they're going. And I was like, okay, well, this is a moving target. If this was a mature industry like shoes or alcohol or fashion, sure, maybe we can meet the consumer where they are. But this is an emerging market. And so truly, the consumer is on an emerging journey. And we've already seen that. I think, you know, edibles, for instance, are being normalized around 5 and 10 milligrams. 1 milligram is not happening. Like that, those low doses that we thought were absolutely needed, maybe not. And look, everybody's personal and everybody has to understand what works for them. And I do advocate for anybody who wants to try cannabis that you start as slow as possible. So if you have a tincture and you can just start drop by drop, and even if it doesn't affect you the first few days that you're trying, better to do that than to try to take a bigger dose and have an adverse reaction, right? And talk about those adverse reactions for a minute. We always hear the stories of people taking too much cannabis, going to the hospital, and then they just sit in the corner and they're fine. Cannabis is a psychoactive drug, but we also know that we have this ECS system, right? The psychoactive component is very subjective. And so if you don't feel that a doctor gave it to you, or you don't feel that you're in a safe place, yes, I think paranoid thoughts can creep up and you get folks concerned that somehow something is going wrong. But usually the minute they're in a safe space, like a hospital, or they're talking to a doctor or a friend with experience, they can calm down and nothing adverse happens. To date, we've had no deaths, of course. That's completely off the table with cannabis. There is no such thing as ODing on cannabis at all. And more importantly, there's no adverse effect on record from using too much cannabis other than I was really, really scared. And look, that's a valid feeling, and I think it should be spoken to. But I think on the consumer journey, where we speak to it is making somebody educated and aware of what they're doing, trying to go slower and lower dose. And if somebody happens to take a big dose, or if they happen to have had too large a dose, then we have to just speak to that, speak to their mind, right? Because their body's probably just going to want to go to sleep. Okay. I'll give you an interesting story on this point before I close out. We move here in Humboldt. We're working right on 4th Street at our first facility. Our first chief financial officer, a guy named Rod, Australian guy, doesn't use cannabis at all, just is not that cannabis person, and it's fine. He's great at finance, and so he's on the team. He comes up to Eureka from Los Angeles. He's exploring. We're showing him the lab. He's working in the lab. And at one point, we were young. This is early 2016. One of the workers had made some homemade brownies. Now, you would think that homemade brownies in a cannabis lab says it all. Well, unfortunately, Rod, not thinking about it, decides to consume some of these brownies, not realizing that they're infused. A few hours later, I get a call. He's at, I think, the AA eating a steak, and he's starting to feel this cannabis happening. And he swears that we dosed him, that we're just trying to indoctrinate him, and he's just a mess, walking back from the AA to the Best Western at the right there at the end of 4th Street. Sure enough, I start talking him down. He doesn't believe me. Luckily, his brother-in-law is a sheriff in Colorado. He calls them, and they calm him down because he has trust with them, and they totally know the score, given that they're living in Colorado and they've had some 4 years of legalization. He calms down the next morning. It's a little bit of a laugh, and it becomes a story that I tell now just to show that, yes, if you get accidentally overdosed, it can be an awful experience, but really we just have to speak to it. There's no actual danger. But because we've been programmed for the last 100 years of how dangerous cannabis is, people can typically freak out. So the point of this lesson is that the consumer is on a journey. It's a moving target, and we're not there yet. Even now, as we look at cannabis, it's not a done deal, right? The way cannabis is being dispensed, the way it's being consumed, and more importantly, the way it's being normalized is not baked yet, no pun intended. We need to figure out how cannabis is going to be part of our normal lives. An example of this is, if you look at any media, any movie, any TV show, whether they're happy or sad, at one point, somebody reaches in a drawer or reaches on a mantle and a bottle of alcohol comes out. We all kind of know the dangers of alcohol, but it's so normalized in our society that whether you're happy, sad, celebrating, mourning, you are going to get alcohol offered to you, right? In fact, if you turn down alcohol in our society, usually somebody thinks that you may have had a previous issue. That's how normalized it is. How will cannabis look normalized in our industry, in our nation and in the world? I don't have the answer to that. I don't think anybody does. And that's where the consumer journey is going, right? Because we haven't fully normalized it. And I can tell you another thing about systemic bias, especially as a person of color. Just because cannabis is legalized doesn't mean our misconceptions of it go away. In fact, the only way for systemic bias to be unrooted is for each and every single individual to take a moment of their time and ask the question, what lingering misconceptions am I harboring about whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's cannabis? When we've been so programmed and so told that something is incorrect or not wrong, and then all of a sudden that changes, legislation is not enough to move the needle. Each and every individual has to do the work, right? And so even now, as cannabis is technically legal in some 43 states, there is still plenty of bias around the plant, and it kind of skews the consumer journey and skews how products are made and offered. And definitely, I think, kind of muddles the potential efficacy and how they could become integrated into normal American life. So I'll move on to the next one, which is systemic bias in cannabis. I think I articulated pretty well how bias works in general. When we have something that as a group collectively we have been told is incorrect, whether that's the notion of homosexuality, whether that's the notion of people of color, whether that's a religious view, whatever those biases are that we hold, once we decide to change them or we start a cultural change, it doesn't just go away on its own. Lots of work needs to be done by each and every single individual to say, oh, I was thinking about this incorrectly, and I need to move past that. And then a new paradigm needs to come in, and a new form of acceptance needs to be normalized. That has not happened for cannabis yet. And because that hasn't happened, cannabis shame, as I like to label it, pops up its head everywhere you look. I'll give you some examples, and I want to have a caveat that this is my personal opinion, and I hold possible that I could be wrong. I think that the beverages around cannabis are a specific form of cannabis shame where we are trying to normalize cannabis by making it look like something else. So we go to bars and we drink. So the thought is, oh, alcohol and cannabis are both intoxicants, so we should be drinking cannabis. That's not accurate. And I want to say very clearly here that cannabis is not like alcohol. If I told you that I was an everyday alcohol user, you'd be like, is he an alcoholic? But I am an everyday cannabis user. And the thing about everyday cannabis use is, to me, that is wellness. And in an over-medicated society, if I wasn't using cannabis, what else might I be using? Xanax, Ambien, Zoloft. There's so many other drugs that we use for sleep, anxiety, and pain management that we use every day, and we're like totally fine with it, even though it's destroying our body. And yet cannabis is an all-natural alternative for daily use. That is the reality. Our biases prevent us from seeing that because we still want to see this illicit drug, and many of the product producers want to put it in this realm. Another way to see that is this notion of medical versus recreational. Both terms are so inadequate. If I broke my leg, I want the opiates. I want the morphine when I'm in shock. But afterwards, for pain management, sure, maybe I should use cannabis instead of a Norco or something like that. If I want to get drunk and black out drunk, I probably want shots of alcohol. Cannabis does neither. I know that for those who don't use cannabis, there seems like, ooh, you could just get way too intoxicated. I think the fact is, once you use cannabis on a regular basis, you'll come to realize, unfortunately, there's only so much intoxication you can take. Your ECS has a finite number of receptors and they get filled, and that's all there is to it. And once you understand that feeling, that's all it is. And then on the medical side, it's not an acute pain manager. It's not the one that you want when you're in shock, right? When you're in shock, you want some of the harder medicines that science has developed. So it finds itself in the middle of medical and recreation in a spot that I like to call wellness. It's an everyday wellness thing to help you. Our body is designed through the ECS system, which I will describe later again, but the ECS system is ready to take in those cannabinoids. I would posit that years before prohibition, just in terms of hemp seed, and the trace amounts of cannabinoids in that being more prolific in our food system, probably provided way more cannabinoids in our foodstuffs than we have now. And you correlate that with the rise of autoimmune diseases, there's a question mark there. And luckily now there are some studies being done to try to relate and see if there's some correlation there. All that being said, is that the bias around cannabis continues to inform how we make the products. Most companies think the money is in this notion of recreational, this notion that somehow cannabis is going to continue to work like an illicit drug, and they're going to sell it like that and sell products like that, sell products on potency like that, as if that's what the consumer wants and needs. Well, one, I think we've already talked about that the consumer is on a journey and can't be trusted to understand what they want or need because they're on a journey trying to find something. We as thought leaders, myself included, hopefully, need to figure out where they're going and how to get them there. And I can tell you that with the money forces that are just trying to capitalize on this, not dealing with their bias and producing products that continue to pigeonhole cannabis either as extremely medical, which falls flat because it's not that acute. It's not that acute for sleep. It's not that acute for pain. It's not that acute for anxiety. If you truly have those ailments in a real deep way, meaning you broke your leg, meaning that you are true insomniac, or you're riddled with anxiety, you may need some harder pharmaceutical drugs. But if you're more in the middle like we are, and it's a wellness thing to enhance your everyday life, yeah, it's going to work. And then if you're looking at it to be like truly recreational, like you want a party started, as we know parties to be boisterous and loud and these kinds of things, no, that's not cannabis either, right? So right now, because of this residual cannabis bias, if you will, this cannabis shame, most of the larger players are not really producing cannabis products that, in my humble opinion, are accurate to where the consumer should be heading. Where I am as a normal cannabis user for now, going on 30 plus years, my colleagues and peers that have also been using cannabis, it's not how it's normalized in their lives either, right? So systemic bias in cannabis is a real thing and a hard lesson learned in that we should be looking at the consumer on a journey, shooting ahead of them to tell them where they're going. To finish this out, what I eventually started telling marketers is, you're right, we do need to meet the consumer where they are. But the only one of us, the only people that are qualified to meet the consumers where they are those of us who know where we're going. So I think I painted a picture that's a little bit dire, but unfortunately, it continues to go down. We launched this industry. Everything is going great. But what we fail to remember is that this is an abundant plant, and the gift of legalization should have been abundance. But I think that is missed. And as I told you guys in the beginning, it was already so hard with all the taxing, licensing, and just systemic bias, making it so hard to be a viable cannabis business. We then undergo price compression. So my lesson learned is price compression is natural. Be ready for it. It's natural in any industry. Those of you who are old enough might remember the original brick cell phones, and only the most rich could have it, right? So the notion of a portable phone, or any new technology for that matter, is isolated by price. But then eventually it becomes normalized, highly, manufacturing, more players come in, whatever those forces are, and then it becomes affordable to everybody, right? So price compression happens in every industry. Well, we go into the cannabis industry with this kind of bias, thinking that we're still in the illicit market and going to just have high margins forever. No, quickly, before even California, we should have seen this. Colorado, Oregon, Washington, those states that legalized before California, quickly become overgrown because this is an abundant plant that nature wants to grow. And all of a sudden we have way too much cannabis and the price starts tanking. So we already have a tenuous environment with overregulation, overtaxation, the commodity price is crashing, prices are crashing, and it totally upsets the market. And we are still riding that wave down now because this artificial separation of states, again, for those of you who don't know, every state is a little fiefdom. So even though California, breadbasket of the nation, should be exporting the same way we do citrus, the same way we do almonds, we should be exporting our amazing cannabis to every state, especially our neighboring states of Arizona and Nevada, who are spending $500,000 a month on electric bills and grow houses, or our Canadian partners that are doing the same. We have to keep all that cannabis in our state. They have to grow all their cannabis in their state, further muddling the issue of how one does business. And more importantly, prices drop in California much quicker than they do in other states because we have a much bigger footprint of cannabis. We have a lot more sun-grown than, let's say, Arizona and Nevada, where they only have to grow indoors. And so all these forces have made it even harder for business. But the lesson learned here is we should have seen price compression coming. And maybe when I say we, I mean I. I should have seen price compression coming, and I'm not alone, because luckily I'm happy to say that while I don't think I said this at the beginning, Papa and Barkley, I am transacting Papa and Barkley. We are merging with a larger entity. I think it was absolutely needed. I wish it hadn't gone that way, but I'm happy to be part of a brand that still survives, because I can tell you about many brands that didn't survive. Many of those first movers, like I told you, ended up on the battlefield. They paid it forward. They got this industry started. Some of the first brands in cannabis don't exist anymore because they were not able to deal with all these forces that made it very untenable. I'm happy that Papa and Barkley will continue to stay on shelves and will continue to provide actual plant medicine in the face of all the other crazy products that are happening. So the number 4 lesson learned is price compression. Be prepared for it. I think that's probably true of any business, and it's an interesting mistake to have made. I think even myself, I'm doing the work of cannabis deprogramming. And yeah, I think for almost 7 or 8 years, from Colorado through the legalization of California, we were selling into a vacuum. And then all of a sudden it just kind of hit this cliff where the prices were just tanking quicker than we could adjust our business. And now we know that. And so as we come into what I hope is Cannabis 2.0, we'll just be smarter about these things, because I think that the price of cannabis has not hit bottom yet. I think cannabis is the kind of plant that wants to position it as an everyday item in our households. That's how much and how easy this plant grows. And more importantly, it does so much. Maybe I'll take a few minutes here to explain the endocannabinoid system again. The endocannabinoid system is a series of receptors, C1 and C2 receptors, that are throughout our body. For a bodily function, I think it's fair to say that it's recently discovered in Israel by a gentleman named Raphael Mechoulam in 1996, discovered that we have this endocannabinoid system and we produce our own cannabinoids. And what we've discerned to date is the endocannabinoid system brings homeostasis or regulates all the other systems of our body. And I know that sounds really broad, but in general, if you have, let's say, an autoimmune disease like MS, MS is when the disease attacks the myelin sheath, the rubber coating of your nerves. So if your nerves are an electrical system, for whatever reason, this autoimmune disease wants to eat away at that myelin sheath, causing those nerves to be open. That static field we register as tremendous pain. Cannabis brings homeostasis to that imbalance, to that static. And that's how we feel that pain relief. Same thing with lupus. With cancer, what we've seen is cancer cells are being produced with high doses of THC. We've seen that stop and in some cases abate. More research needs to be done. I'm not saying that cannabis is the cure for cancer, but what we have seen is that there is definitely a relation between autoimmune diseases and cannabis. Moreover, when we think about cancer patients, if you are going through chemo or if you know anybody that's going through, I highly recommend that you suggest that they move to a THC-based pain relief product. And the reason is this. One, the Norcos that they use for pain management typically, one will start to make you constipated. That means you can't eat. That means you can't get energy for your body to repair after it's been blasted with the chemo. Secondly, you're often prescribed a antidepressant because chronic pain brings depression. Cannabis can do both without an addictive quality, so that when you decide to step back from it, you don't have to wean yourself off. So it's kind of a shame that we have this powerful, powerful medicine that is perfect for those who are going through chemo. And even now, certain places, I understand in Germany, they provide vapor bags, and there are certain oncology centers now that allow folks to use their vape pen or eat gummies before, and it's the right call. Okay, but yeah, the ECS system, again, just to recap, is this thing that goes through our body. It's throughout, skin, everywhere, and the cannabinoids bond with these receptors to bring balance to other systems, right? I wish I could say more. One, it's probably above my head. Two, I do know that there's a lot more research to be done because, as I said in the beginning, we really fully haven't dove into true academic research of this plant in an objective way, in an honest way, right? It's only now, after how many years the feds are looking at the same data that they had in the 60s and 70s, and are like, oh, maybe we should reschedule this. Yeah, that part. So price compression is natural. Be prepared for it. I think I touched on this earlier. The fifth lesson is cannabis doesn't fit neatly into the recreational box. And what I mean by that is when we say recreation and having fun, we often think about social lubricant. We talk about being chatty at the bar. We talk about letting our hair down and just being a little bit more outside of our shell. Unfortunately, that's not cannabis. It hasn't been my experience. I don't think it's really the experience that cannabis wants to give us. And in fact, the stoner meme of folks just sitting around quietly, while folks used to say that disparagingly, I would say to you, look at it through another lens. If alcohol makes us just want to talk and chat and say nonsense, cannabis makes us want to look inside and think deeply and be more reflective. And I do believe that's true. And more than ever, I think we need to encourage folks to be more reflective, to take a pause. In this late stage capitalism that we live in with social media and this arc of technology that's almost now vertical, where every day we have new innovation, new things to learn, new things to deal with, new problems to deal with, more than ever, I think cannabis is that respite where we can use it to be quiet, to bring the mind to quietness, to look inside and think, what can I do better for me? it is the ultimate form of wellness, which is why I've dedicated my life to trying to share it with others. I want others to be able to, even if they only have 5 minutes, be able to partake in cannabis and just slow everything down and take that much needed reflective breath. And so when I think about recreation, I don't think about cannabis as like, oh yeah, we're going to have this huge party. You might think that from the drug culture days, that somehow it's something that you take at a concert or you take at a rave. That's not accurate. It's not even remotely accurate. It's more likely that two people sit and imbibe in cannabis, and yeah, maybe they have a little conversation and long pauses of just being quiet. Maybe there's some nonsensical chatter that then breaks into much deeper thought. And I think that deeper thought, that reflection is so needed in society. And perhaps it'll bring about a new kind of recreation. But when I say cannabis doesn't fit neatly in a recreational box, I'm really saying that the way we now like to, whether it's going to a family barbecue, going to a pub, going to a concert, that's not the kind of recreation I think cannabis wants to offer us. I think what it might want to offer us is more akin to like guided meditation, guided yoga practices, things that allow us to commune first and foremost with ourselves. I think that's where cannabis is leading us. And perhaps if we're lucky, we will get recreational centers where that's what you do. Imagine if you went into a public place where it was more like a library, where by definition you come in to relax, to be quiet, not to be loud, to think, to be with yourself, to sip some tea and just think for a minute. That could be what a cannabis lounge is. I can tell you the cannabis lounges I've been to, maybe they're playing music and they're trying to give a vibe, but most people are sitting quietly in their little huddles, doing their thing, or they're there alone. That is the nature of cannabis lounges, and I'd like to pursue it that way. But again, I think forces continue to want to put us in this box of recreational, continue to want to see how this can be monetized more like the beer and alcohol model and less like a new model of thinking, right? I think that cannabis has the potential to make it cool to be slow, to make it cool to be mellow, to make it cool to be quiet. I don't know. But that is definitely my lesson learned, is that I don't believe that cannabis fits neatly into this notion of a recreational box as we have it now. So my sixth lesson learned is treating cannabis like other consumer products requires nuance. Yeah, I think I've started to allude to that. What I mean here is that we want to think of cannabis as a typical consumer goods product, but it's not. One, because it is psychoactive, and that psychoactive component brings a certain amount of subjectivity to it. Okay, I can tell you from years ago when I was in the illicit market, if I gave you a cannabis product and you had trust and I told you it was amazing, you would more likely have an amazing feeling. If I told you it wasn't, or if I said nothing, you could do whatever you want. I judge a cannabis festival or a cannabis competition called the Emerald Cup. And one of our older statesmen, a few years ago was like, when you guys are judging, you got to curate your set and setting. And at first I was like, what is he talking about? And then I was like, oh, I had already fallen into, I'm 52 now, so I'm a little bit, I've had some time to understand my cannabis use. I didn't realize that I often use cannabis at the same time, in the same setting, and that's how I know what's going on. And so if I'm judging some 300 samples, perhaps I want to try those in the same set and setting, because the setting and the mindset affect how cannabis works. So if that's true, of course it's different than other consumer products, right? Because most consumer products, when you go into a Target, they do what they say they do. They are what they are. It's like they're very straightforward. There is no subjectivity about it. Whereas cannabis, not so much. I can tell you that Papa and Barkley put out an amazing sleep product. I formulated it myself. However, even in the back of my mind, sometimes I'm like, does it work just because it says sleep on the bag in such big letters? I'm not sure. I can tell you that the mind makes it real with cannabis. In the first few years of Papa and Barkley, we have thousands, and I say this, thousands of unsolicited testimonials that are nothing less than miracles, from people walking again and leaving their crutches behind, to people regrowing their hair back. We had a young lady who was supposed to have her arm amputated, started using our salve, and now doesn't have to. You all know what the placebo effect is. And I can tell you with cannabis, especially coming out of the illicit market, these first few years, I've seen some amazing things. The mind makes it real. And I don't think that we've evaluated cannabis deeply enough and its psychoactive component and how it can help us make things real. It's a nuance. And so I don't believe that we can just go at cannabis like any other CPG good, have it in dispensaries, wish for it to be in Target, because it's something different. It's something different. And honestly, that's what we advocated for. We advocated for a different wellness paradigm. We advocated for this plant medicine to do something miraculous, and it can. It has produced miracles for folks. I'm sure we've all heard stories of people, finding cancer or fighting cancer with cannabis, or flying their, loved ones to an emerging state like Colorado or California, getting some choice medicine, Rick Simpson oil, and having just these miraculous effects. Well, yes, these miraculous effects are because of cannabis. Maybe they're because of cannabinoids interacting with the ECS system, and maybe they're because the mind makes it real. Either way, that nuance around how cannabis works and how cannabis will work for us makes it way too complicated to just be a regular consumer product. It just does, in my opinion. So that's my sixth lesson learned. This notion of just going about treating cannabis like it's just any other product and any other active ingredient, like caffeine or something. No, I think there's something else there. There's a nuance there, and that nuance is in that psychoactivity, in that subjective, like, the mind can make it real, right? I think cannabis, as I was telling you, already offers us introspection. And I think there's a deeper connection that yet has to be exploited around how cannabis can really, really work. I'll give you just a sidebar of my overall philosophy around plant medicine. I think cannabis is the over-the-counter plant medicine. I think psilocybin, you might want to have some instruction or have it prescribed to you. And we already see a lot of people microdosing psilocybin in its different forms and different strains and getting efficacy. And then, of course, I think there are other master plants where you might want a guided practitioner, whether that's ayahuasca or, these other higher plant medicines that cause you to truly go within, and where you might want somebody holding your lifeline, right? We have not explored these deep ritualistic medicines that really allow us to commune with our body to get that profound healing. We know the mind can make it real. I think it's hard to deny the notion of the placebo effect, the notion that the mind can manifest not only disease, but cure. The question is, how do we unlock that? And do these plant medicines offer some insight into it? Possibly. Lots more research needs to be done. And I think the gift of legalization is the potential for that research to be done. But in the meantime, as we are doing the over-the-counter thing with the legalization of cannabis, I think we'd be wise not to try to just fit it in that regular CPG box. Okay, I'm moving quickly because I see that the time is just going. So I got a few more here. I'll go through these quickly because they're a little bit less impactful. Celebrity endorsements do not guarantee cannabis quality. Yeah, I mean, is that a lesson learned? Sure. I mean, should it be a lesson for every product? Probably, right? But what we have in our industry now is what I call alpha consumers. No disrespect to the people like Seth Rogen or Snoop Dogg or Willie Nelson or Woody Harrelson. These are all folks who may have used cannabis, and thank you for them for bringing eyeballs to their use. However, they're not craftspeople or cannabis producers. They don't make quality products. They license their name. And unfortunately, because of the nature of business, they license their name, and often their products are just not the best. It's just that simple, right? So just because a celebrity is endorsing a product, unfortunately, there's a business model there. And I can tell you, having worked in entertainment, oftentimes the celebrity doesn't even know. It's just a deal that their agent does so that there's just more money in the bank, right? So when you're looking for cannabis products, I don't think just because somebody's a celebrity means that they know what a good product is or has the ability to produce a good product. My eighth lesson learned is a unified voice is crucial for cannabis advocacy. What do I mean by that? Well, in our nation, for whatever reasons, a strong lobby is how things get done. And while I don't always agree with this particular organization, I will cite them and use them as probably the pinnacle of what a unified voice is. And to me, that is the NRA. I'll say one, I am a gun owner, but I also believe in really strong gun regulations, right? That being said, the NRA has a strong, unified voice. Their message is clear, it's distinct, it's unwavering, and Washington will never be able to do anything because that's how focused and laser focused they are. Cannabis, on the other hand, has a bunch of disparate organizations. Every other day, I hear about another organization. Nobody has two pennies to rub together, and we're just out there. And without that unified voice, the folks that we look to take market share from, like, I don't think it requires a lot of brain power to realize that we're going to take market share from pharma. We're going to take market share from alcohol. We're going to take market share potentially from tobacco. These are all industries that have very strong voices, very strong lobbies. They're already calling the shots in Washington. And where's our voice? We don't have one. And I don't really know the answer to this one. What I do know is we don't have a unified voice. I know there's National Cannabis Industry Association. I know that there's the Marijuana Policy Project. I know that there's Americans for Safe Access. I know that there's the Hemp Coalition. But yet, somehow, we don't have that NRA-style lobby where we are galvanized to put cannabis down this lane. And maybe it's because we don't know. It's easy to say, we're about the Second Amendment. But in cannabis, we're about wellness. We're about what is that singular drumbeat that we can get all organizations and all cannabis people under that umbrella so that we have that firm pillar in Washington articulating our voice and needs as an industry. I don't know, but a unified voice is crucial for cannabis advocacy. And finally, my ninth lesson learned is the gift of legalization is abundance. And what I mean by that is I have been on this journey. And so when I say these statements, they are about lessons learned. I made the mistakes, I learned from them, and I hope that we can all move quickly and not necessarily have to make the same mistakes. When I was cultivating years ago in the closet, as they say, I looked for things like one-hit wonder. Potency was very important. Scarcity made it seem like you wanted to have the strongest product, similar to alcohol prohibition, where you would want to have moonshine, so then you could dilute it down and you had plenty of alcohol to parse out and make your little cocktails or whatever. Same thing with cannabis. During prohibition, scarcity is just driving us. And at my first opportunity to build a legal lab, what is my first thought? Potency. Boiling it down to active pharmaceutical ingredients, trying to make the strongest THC possible, because I was still experiencing a prohibition mindset, a scarcity mindset. I thought, oh my God, I have to take this plant, I have to concentrate it and milk every little bit out of it possible. But what I failed to see, and what I did not see until I started Papa and Barkley, is, oh, the gift of legalization is abundance. I need to change my mindset. The awesome thing about legalization is we now have freed the plant, and many states like California are overgrown, where there's plenty of cannabis. And yet you go into a dispensary and cannabis can be upwards of 6 months old if you're just buying the flower. Why? Supply chain issues? Because they feel they have to sell it? Meanwhile, it really should be more like lettuce or produce, where you use it, and if it's getting old, we discard it because there's so much of it. But we're not nearly there from an economic model. We're not even there from a mental understanding of like, oh, wait, we don't have to drill down to every single milligram. And when I say that, I'm not talking about track and trace or the notion of safety around intoxicating drugs. Sure, if the states want to regulate down to the milligram and track every milligram so that there's no diverting of an intoxicant, I get that. However, as from a price point, the notion of price per milligram, the notion of buying cannabis just solely based on its, quote, THC or CBD or cannabinoid content, we don't buy alcohol like that. You don't walk into a bar and say, give me the strongest alcohol. No, because there's plenty. You want something that you can sip and you can drink and you can taste. And even now, as our dispensary model still seems to focus on potency, it's like if you and I were sitting down like we are now and we're going to use cannabis, wouldn't we want to use something that tastes great, feels great, has a great effect, and more importantly, doesn't just knock us out right away, something that we could use and commune with for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, right? We don't go into a bar looking for that one shot that's going to knock us out. We usually want to have a few cocktails and commiserate, right? Well, with cannabis, you can always smoke more or eat another gummy or take more tincture. Shouldn't it be at that level where it's about the experience? We're not even having that conversation right now in cannabis. Potency still rules the day. If you walk into a dispensary, often products are positioned based on their milligram count and how potent they are, not how they were sourced, not what the values of the company are, not how the extracts were made, not how the flower was grown. These things don't seem as important right now to the retailers and even to the uneducated consumer, because we're still kind of having this prohibition hangover where there's still this scarcity, this thought that like, oh, I'm so excited to get it, it just has to be strong. But my lesson learned here is that the gift of legalization is abundance. We should be thinking about cannabis abundantly. I say that, and I'll tell you that even I still have a trouble, like, when I have what they call a roach, a cannabis cigarette that has been already smoked, I tend to keep it. I would never have done that with cigarettes when I was a smoker. You don't keep the trace amounts of your can of beer. If you don't finish it, you don't put it back in the fridge. I'm not advocating for waste, but at the same time, I am advocating that we start to embrace abundance and change some of the misconceptions around the way we use cannabis. And this, I say this even for the more indoctrinated into cannabis, right? Even for those who've used cannabis for quite some time, I would ask us to reflect and say, okay, well, I really appreciate all the things that we did during Prohibition and the legacy culture of cannabis, if you will, but now that we're not in that legacy culture and we're in this new paradigm of legalization and abundance, what can I change? What should change? An example of this is the notion of aromatherapy. People are like, what, cannabis aromatherapy? Well, right now, aromatherapy in cannabis is called concentrates, meaning that we concentrate cannabis down to an essential oil, almost exactly how we concentrate lavender flowers down into a lavender essential oil, right? Lavender has similar trichomes on it, similar to the cannabis plant. We get those essential oils, and now we have an essential oil that smells strongly of lavender or smells strongly of cannabis, right? Each one of those can be put on a warming plate, and they effervesce. They don't smoke, they vaporize, and they smell amazing, like lavender or like cannabis. Well, what if I told you that in the days of abundance, we should be able to not have to smoke carcinogens? We should be able to just take cannabis aromatherapy and take deep breaths in until we feel what we need to feel. That is, to me, I know, clearly the future. But right now, we're still selling concentrates as if they're super potent. We're holding them hostage only for those who want the most potent. And we're still doing it in a way that's not aromatherapy because we don't want it to waste into the air, right? So there's just some preconceptions and mindsets from the legacy market that need to shift to allow this true abundance of legalization to step forward, okay? So those are my 9 lessons learned. And I'm sure we have tons of questions, and I'm sorry that I took so much time, but I will now answer as many of these questions as possible. So I think I've answered the endocannabinoids question. Here's one from John. It seems the industry will be long subject to fear-mongering since we see how easily misinformation is spread, how to combat that over time. The way I look at it, John, is I have to be faithful, and I look at misinformation and truth as the tortoise and the hare. Misinformation will fly off the starting line and run rampant, but it will not win the race. Truth will not go away. It will make it eventually. The question is a matter of time, and I don't know what that time is. I've been patiently waiting for 25 years for folks to be blessed with the gift of cannabis, and maybe I'll have to wait another 25 before it's fully normalized. I don't really know. So Jane, you asked, what leads our bodies to produce endocannabinoids? That's a great question. why we produce them on our own, I actually have never been asked that question. I think I need to do more research, and that is above my pay grade right now. I do know that we produce several cannabinoids that help us regulate and work with our ECS system, but I don't know what prompts us to produce our own cannabinoids. So I haven't been stumped in a while. I thank you for that one. I'm gonna have to look that up.
I think that's really an interesting question because we have this system. Our bodies produce them naturally in response to what? Okay. So if it's creates homeostasis between what and what, between pain and pleasure, between what and what. So if we have it already, then consuming it shouldn't be damaging in any way, unless it throws our systems way off balance.
Yeah.
Okay. So I haven't ever heard that kind of discussion.
Yeah. No,
And
that's a great it's a great one. Yeah, I do know that we produce our own cannabinoids. I just don't know why. And yeah, to the point of like, can we take too much? Can we take, how does it affect our balance? And I think that leads into your next question about, I do know a lot of people, especially at their first use, they get a racy mind, right? You're wound up. I think that's a function of the psychoactive effect, that subjective nature of just like your mind is trying to understand the feeling and it feels amped up. I think that I don't think that's a persistent feeling over time. And so I think that the answer there is one, start lower, right? So meaning that if whatever dose you took, you take a smaller dose to allow yourself to get just enough of efficacy where you can kind of wrap your head around the feeling, and then you titrate up. But most users of cannabis are always seeking for that sativa experience or that more uplifting experience. It rarely works that way. There are cases where folks who have like ADHD use cannabis, and then all of a sudden it does focus them in, where most of us actually experience more of that unfocused, like too many thoughts going on. But yeah, I think that's what I was talking about, that like psychological component, that psychoactive component. Everybody is different. Everybody's brain is different. Setting is different. And so I guess the question is, if it does wind you up, it might be worth it to be in a very calm, safe space and see where those thoughts are going, right? Now, why would somebody want to invest time into trying to use cannabis? I think it's for the ultimate after effects of being able to say, oh, I can use cannabis, for pain management. I can use cannabis to help me sleep. I can use cannabis for anxiety. And compared to all the other medicines, the natural nature of it makes it a better outcome. And why would I want to go ahead and why should I invest time in it? Well, I'll bring the alcohol model up, or any analgesic for that matter. Normally, when you're prescribed something, or if you can remember when you had your first drink, usually doesn't work the way it's supposed to right away. Even when your doctor will be like, just keep trying it for a few days, let it set up, right? And you'll have these weird effects. Or when you're drinking, when you were younger, 1 or 2 beers and it's too much. And then eventually you get to understand what your tolerance is and whatnot. I think cannabis, because of demonization and everything, rarely is afforded that opportunity to be titrated correctly and allow the body to kind of understand what's happening so that it can then start to give you benefits. That would be my answer. But again, always a personal choice.
well, Dusty, you said arachidonic acid is the main human endocannabinoid. What causes the production of arachidonic acid?
So it's predominantly used in cellular signaling, and it's found in receptors all over the body. So it has to deal with autoimmunity. It is not one of those single molecules that deals with, like, it's not a neurotransmitter like serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, where it binds to a singular site, but it deals as an intermediary molecule that affects kind of all of them. So I know it binds to alpha A1, which deals with vasodilation. It deals with the D2 receptor, which
Does
so
it
dopamine 2
reduce
receptor
vasodilation?
increases blood flow. So when you look at autism spectrum conditions, there's impairment in signal cascading because of reduced or impaired or structural considerations with how arachidonic acid is produced. So that's why there's potential in certain patients augmentation with phytocannabinoid introduction to those patients.
The chemistry of it is fascinating, because when you look at it, that aspect, my husband used it to reduce the effects of glutamic acid, which glutamate is a neurotransmitter, the primary excitatory neurotransmitter. So it functions kind of like GABA in reducing the glutamic acid impact, excitatory, which causes migraines, causes tinnitus, things like that.
Toxicity at high levels.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why it works so well for migraines and for epilepsy, things like that, because it has a calming effect. And I don't know about the stimulating effect of it on the other side, but I think it'd be really interesting to have people understand more what it does, and clearly understand that it's not going to kill you. It's not going to be toxic in that way. It can be so sedative, in fact, that nobody has any motivation to do anything. That's what they worry about, kids using it and then not wanting to bother to do their homework or do anything. They're just sitting there happily having their nice time, relaxed, and not having energy to do anything else. So I think we need to really look at, I mean, I like your concepts as a business, but I think I would love to see us focus on what it is, what it isn't, why it's safe, why it is useful for certain issues people have, like epilepsy, like tinnitus, whatever have you. How to use it, like as a tincture versus, a vapor, things like that. I don't think people have that concept of using it as aromatherapy, for example. That's the first time I've ever heard about that. But I would love to talk to you further about this. But does anybody else have any questions?
Jane, I'll say on that point, it's like more research needs to be done. And what's interesting is, I can sometimes get down on pharma, but like we need to demand more. The notion of active, like our pharmaceutical industry, our medical industry wants to look at isolated compounds and what they do, and that's that.
Well, they want to make a drug out of it.
But yeah, but we're complicated individuals. And the cool thing about plant medicine is, yeah, each strain, maybe even batch, is different in terms of like multiple cannabinoids, multiple terpenes, which are filled with ketones and esters, and it all counts, right? And Montel had posited a long time ago that what we should be doing is tracking people's use and health and overall healthcare to find their combination and then find the plant combination that works with them, because that's when you get that miracle, right? When you find that right strain with whatever complex combination it is. I think pharma has to start to understand that maybe they won't be able to recreate nature. But what's also interesting about natural medicines is their low toxicity, right? So unlike some of the harder drugs that we create pharmaceutical-wise that have a myriad of side effects, including death sometimes, plant medicines, while they're complicated and slightly changing over time, have a low toxicity and should always, I think, be the first course of action, or the first line of defense is to try different forms of these herbs, if you will, before going too hardcore. And I think in the case of like chemo, that's the obvious one. Why not try pain management with something that is non-toxic, right, and easy to get off of, rather than going to something that at the very least brings constipation, or in the case of the antidepressants, brings long-term addiction. I think whenever we're thinking about something that somebody has to do on an everyday basis, we have to look at the natural alternatives, even if it's impossible to codify. And obviously, if we can't codify it, that means we can't IP it, and that means we can't profit off of it the way the model provides for now. But I think wellness just demands that we figure out that even if you can buy it at the farmer's market, and everybody can do it and everybody can grow it, it's the right way to go. And we should be spending more research on overall plant medicine and natural healing before we go to pharma. But in saying that, I could also say the first thing your doctor should ever talk to you about is diet and exercise. And it's often the last thing they talk about, right? So I think that when we think about plant medicine, we can expand that to say your diet, the things that you consume naturally, is your first actual line of defense. That is not how we are taught, especially in the United States, to think about our healthcare and our wellness. We're taught to extend our hand and wait for the magic pill. But I would say that hopefully cannabis can start to change that paradigm by opening our eyes to, oh, wait, medicine doesn't have to be toxic. It doesn't have to be addictive, and it doesn't have to have the pain of weird death-like side effects for it to be effective.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Guy. Does anybody else have any issues or questions that they want to ask at this point? If not, I want to thank Guy for presenting today and suggest that you come back next week on July 8th to talk about Life Plan Humboldt. They have the architect is going to be there and will be laying out the design of what they're proposing to build in McKinleyville. And you'll probably want to, we're of the age, it could be of interest. So please do come back, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much. And thank you, Guy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.